And we are live. This is our second talk in 2 days, so welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this particular installment of the NAF Research and Tech Talk series. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Nick Minar. I'm the Director of Research and Reporting here at NAF. In case you missed our talk yesterday, I spoke with Martha Ross over at Brookings Metro on how quality work-based learning experiences can address equity gaps, especially for students of color. It was a great conversation, so be sure to check it out on our NAF YouTube channel to catch the replay. But today we have a great talk lined up for you as well, and thanks very much everyone for joining us live. Just like yesterday's talk, we will be posting the recording of this talk to our NAF YouTube channel, to our NAF Educator Facebook page, and also our NAF Research and Tech LinkedIn page after the event. So if you haven't done so already, I'm going to drop a link to each of those three in the chat now. Oh, gotta admit some more peeps. So I'll be dropping a link to each of those here. Be sure to give us a follow on LinkedIn and check out our playlist on YouTube, and be sure to check out our NAF Educator Facebook page as well. Furthermore, I already kind of mentioned this to some folks initially, but feel free to say hi in the chat. Just let us know who you are, where you're joining us from today. As I said, we like to make a small learning community where everyone is kind of free to ask questions or make comments. So don't be shy and feel like, you have an open voice here. If you've never attended one of these research and tech talks before, that's quite all right. The purpose of these talks is to bring cutting-edge research and best practices to all of you, our NAF educators, our NAF staff, or really just anyone doing work that serves young people in this country. We're hoping you can use the information that you're exposed to here just to improve your practice, or perhaps get ideas about how to better serve the students or the young people that you are working with. So as such, don't be afraid to ask questions or make comments kind of throughout the talk today. And we'll have Katherine and Claire kind of answer them as we go along. Or if you would prefer to hold your question until the very end, we're going to have some dedicated Q&A time there. So whichever method you would prefer to engage us is fine with me. All right, so let me introduce our guests. Our guests today are Dr. Katherine Shields and Dr. Claire Waterman. I'm going to get them both spotlighted so that you can see them nice and big in the frame. 1 second. All right. So I'll introduce Katherine first. Dr. Katherine Shields is a senior researcher and a program evaluator at the Education Development Center, or EDC, and she has a focus on college and career readiness. Katherine herself is a former evaluator of workforce development programs. She works with districts and state agencies to understand really what drives student success in career and technical education, early college programs, and pathways from school to career. Important to note, Dr. Shields is our first repeat guest on the NAF Research and Tech Talk series. Katherine, if you attend 3 more, you get a free pizza on the house. So working towards that. Really quickly, just wanted to introduce also Dr. Claire Waterman, first time meeting Dr. Waterman. She is also a researcher and evaluator at the Education Development Center, and she has a focus on evaluating education policy and practice across a variety of topics. Her current work includes an evaluation of the Opportunity Network's College Access and Success Fellowship Program, as well as a project examining the association of student participation in work-based learning opportunities and their secondary and post-secondary outcomes. We admit some more people. So I'm really happy to have the chance to sit down with Katherine and Claire today and just have this chat around a brand new toolkit that they published earlier this year. It is aptly named Work-Based Learning Data Collection, a Toolkit. Katherine and Claire, you're already on screen, but go ahead and unmute yourselves. And it's just great to see you today. And thanks very much for taking the time to join us for this Research and Tech Talk.
Thank you, Nick, and it's great to be a repeat guest here. I'm looking forward to earning my punch cards with more talks. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick to talk a little bit about this toolkit to get us started. So this work really grew out of a collaboration that our team had developed with a large school district in California. And I see we've got a member here from the Northern California area. So the school district we're working with is in Elk Grove. This collaboration was around studying career academy outcomes. So that's a district that has numerous career academies as pocket academies within their various high schools, as well as other career pathways, and really wanted to understand better what were the outcomes of those students going through those programs. So for those of you who saw my first talk a couple of years ago with Research and Tech, we talked a little bit about the findings from that study, which is funded by the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. So from working through that study, and from working with our other district and state agency partners around the country, we're often hearing from educators and administrators like yourselves that folks want better data about their students' experiences with work-based learning and the outcomes and gains that students get from those experiences. But it can be hard to get those data, and they're not kind of a part of people's regular systems yet in a lot of places. And it can be a real challenge for the reasons you're all aware of. That work-based learning happens all over the place. Like some of it might happen in an agricultural setting or in a livestock barn. Some of it might happen in a classroom. Some of it might happen after school. There's a lot of activities that aren't very closely monitored. It might be very student driven, like an internship or a student-based enterprise. And of course, there's always a lot of tasks on educators' plates. So it's sort of one more thing that needs to be fit in. So our team developed this toolkit really to try to help schools think through some of those challenges and be able to get a leg up on developing a solid work-based learning data collection system that serves their needs. And the Elk Grove district we were working with was really interested in upgrading their system so that they could comply with state reporting requirements about work-based learning. And they also really wanted data that they could use to improve their programs and target their programs a little bit more with a little bit more nuance. And on our side of thinking about the research questions, we wanted to be able to understand who's participating in work-based learning and what are the outcomes that they're experiencing depending on what kind of work-based learning they were participating in. So those needs kind of all came together to work around kind of helping them upgrade their system, and the toolkit kind of shares what we learned from that. So I'm going to pass it to Claire to talk a little bit about just really briefly kind of what's in the toolkit.
Thanks, Katherine. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Good. Thumbs up are good. So when we were thinking about this toolkit and thinking about the audience of really folks who are on the ground trying to do the data collection or implement systems, we kind of tried to pick out what would be the most valuable pieces of this process to highlight, because obviously it's a pretty in-depth process, as many of you probably know if you've already tried to engage or have engaged in this work. So of course we have an introduction that kind of goes through in more detail what Katherine was just speaking to in terms of why might this be a valuable thing to be engaging in, and then we kind of go through some of the pieces of the process that we went through in order to walk Elk Grove through this process. So the first was seems pretty simple, but it's identifying your goals for work-based learning data collection, and it might seem simple, but what you collect data on might differ depending on what your purpose is. So that section kind of walks folks through that piece of things. And then kind of relatedly deciding what to collect and how to define it. So one of the big pieces, I think, for folks is really thinking carefully about how you define what it is that you're collecting data on so that everyone's speaking the same language. And so that section kind of talks a little bit about ways in which folks can go through that process to make sure that everyone's consistently collecting the same data that's defined in the same ways. And then establishing the process for data collection. So this part goes through things like what software program might you want to use. Do you have an existing program or student information system that can be utilized for this process? And so there are various different decision-making I keep saying processes, so it's kind of throwing me off. I apologize. But different levels of decision making, things that you need to make decisions on related to how you're actually going to do it, what that process looks like, and that section talks about that. And then in terms of using the data, what are some things that you can do with the data once you have it? And that section kind of goes through that as well. One thing that we wanted to also be cognizant of is that many districts like Elk Grove and others are working collaboratively with researchers and evaluators. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a piece in there for researchers and evaluators, because oftentimes researchers don't have a lot of experience working collaboratively or as closely with district partners as we have had the opportunity to do. And so making sure that, you know, while they're wearing their research hat, they're also wearing that hat of understanding kind of what does this potentially look like when you roll this out in school districts, and considering the work that you're doing in that context. And so that goes through that process as well. So yeah, that's the main overarching overview of the toolkit itself.
Thank you very much for that overview. And I went ahead and pasted the link to download that toolkit in the chat. It is freely available from EDC, so please do check it out. And we're going to kind of dive into it here, just kind of hearing from the experts as they kind of went through this process and from their experience. But also, don't forget, if you have a question for Katherine or Claire and you would like us to answer it kind of right away, feel free to insert that in the chat and we'll do our best to address it as they come up. But yeah, if I could maybe start out with a question for Katherine and Claire. This toolkit, in my opinion, is really timely, just because it seems to me that the field of education and education research is really shifting to try to examine and better understand what those work-based learning activities for young students, what that impact actually is. So you kind of gave us a nice little overview of that toolkit, but did you create this toolkit in mind so that it could be a resource for anyone looking to track work-based learning, or does it have to be, you know, specifically a school or a school district, or could maybe someone doing an after-school program who might be interested in work-based learning also find some useful tidbits in your toolkit?
Sure. Well, we did create this starting off for kind of the primary audience being schools, especially middle schools and high schools, and local education agencies like districts. But having said that, it really, I think the basic ideas in it are applicable for a single career academy program or an after-school program. If they're especially interested in kind of thinking about, well, even if it's a small scale data collection, you might want to think about, well, what am I going to collect and why? And so it's got some pointers in there. So folks could apply it in a lot of different ways. And I think, even if you're already kind of, I know that NAF has done some really great work around thinking about work-based learning data collection. And if you already are doing some of that, it can be a nice way to, work through sort of common interpretation of terms and procedures that, for implementing a system that you might have.
Awesome. That's really great to hear. Is there anything else our audience should know about the toolkit before we kind of dive into it? Just any lingering thoughts you want to inform us about, or are you both ready to dive in?
I think I'm ready to dive in, but just really want to acknowledge our partners in Elk Grove. They put the time in on the ground to really make this happen and make it work in the real world. So just a shout out to them for all the work on it.
Yeah. Now, this toolkit, I've had the pleasure of reading it through a couple times, but it describes a system and really lessons learned from tracking work-based learning at the student level. Now, for our audience, if you're unsure what that term means, that means that individual work-based learning experiences like job shadows, mock interviews, or internships are tracked on a per-student basis, and that could potentially be aggregated for things like Perkins 5 reporting or any other kind of district continuous improvement process. I just wanted to make that point clear before we kind of move right into it and start going over some of what you've actually outlined in the toolkit. But Katherine and Claire, really one of the first steps you outlined in that toolkit that Claire just mentioned for implementing this kind of work-based learning tracking system is for a school system or whoever's doing the tracking, I guess, to identify their goals. Now, we wanted to highlight this specifically because this could also help a school district or anyone tracking work-based learning kind of achieve some equity goals that they might be working towards. Can you walk us through a little bit what kinds of things typically are those goals, or what kinds of things you experienced when working with Elk Grove when they were identifying their goals?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I think I think this, and that is an important distinction, and thank you for pointing that out, Nick, that this is really focused on student level work-based learning data collection. So Elk Grove, like many other districts, collected information on kind of what types of work-based learning activities were happening in general, how many students were attending, but they really weren't able to ask questions specifically around what who was accessing it and what does that look like. So bringing up also that equity piece of things, I think that especially as school districts and schools and after school programs and others become increasingly cognizant of equity of access to different types of programming, that this will probably pop up as a pretty typical goal in terms of thinking about what is that equity and access to work-based learning opportunities. So for example, with Elk Grove, one of the things that we are looking at and is kind of who, what by student demographics, understanding who's accessing more often. So in terms of thinking of just quantity, but also kind of when we think about the levels, which we detail in the toolkit, the levels of work-based learning activities kind of going from the less intensive to the more intensive, are we seeing differences in who's accessing each of those? And so, thinking that's one of the ways in which, another way, of course, is complying with requirements. So I know California has, they're changing their requirements. And one of the things, even just for students who, for example, are applying to California schools, that one of the application questions is around kind of how many hours did they have internship, right? So for students to be able to access their own student level data, in addition to thinking about kind of what are the state level requirements for what they're reporting. So those are kind of some of the things that popped up, particularly, and and that equity piece I think does get to some of the thinking about that continuous quality improvement and thinking about how might you inform your programs and your policies based on the data that you have, which the more granular. It's one of those hard ones to say at 3:49 in the evening or afternoon. The smaller unit of data, the more information you have, and you can always aggregate up, but you can't aggregate down. So really thinking about kind of the purposes that you might think about for that. From a research perspective, of course, that gets at that continue, the quality improvement and informing policies and practices. It's much easier to kind of look at the relationships between students and their outcomes if we have better understanding of exactly what their experiences were. So I think I've gone a little bit in a circle, and I'd love for Katherine to jump in and let me know if there's anything that I left out that we wanted to make sure that we got in there.
Well, I just wanted to flag that one other goal that was really important to the district was kind of mapping out, were there any holes in their programming? So they tend to use that sort of work-based learning continuum as a guide. So, that sort of progression from awareness to exploration to preparation to training, and wanting to make sure that you didn't have a system where maybe you've got a whole bunch of ninth graders that get, job fair exposure, and then a bunch of seniors who get internships in kind of a desert in the middle. So they wanted to watch out and make sure there weren't holes like that. And they had been kind of mapping their offerings onto that, but this allowed them to really see more carefully, well, are there just a few students who are getting a lot of opportunities across that continuum, or are we in fact, across the grade levels really having a rich set of experiences?
I love that. I love that, because that's also really important from NAF's perspective as well. We kind of adopt the same work-based learning continuum, and really just want to make each of those phases equitable in it being offered to any student, right? So kind of tracking work-based learning as you've outlined it in your toolkit at a student level is really valuable for that, because you can see where those gaps exist. So I'm really happy to hear that that was one of the priorities that that Elk Grove, the district you were working with, was trying to hone in on. Do you feel like they were able to hone in on that based on just your experience with them, or like how useful was it, and were they actually kind of implementing any changes or any continuous improvement based on the data?
Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I just had, so I mean, so yes, we're kind of in the process. So the unfortunate timing of a lot of this is COVID. And so in terms of the richness of the data, we're still, I think this coming year, we are anticipating to have a wider breadth of data available for students. We have been able to do some preliminary analyses descriptively with them, but I think in terms of, because the data is so sparse, just because of the ability to even engage in work-based learning opportunities over the last couple of years, I think that that's just delayed some of the decision making based on that work. But I do think we have had some very interesting conversations around equity and the implications and thoughts that district leaders that we've been working closely with have around the importance of what they're seeing. Katherine, anything else?
Yeah, just to add to that, so one thing that they were really interested in looking at was being able to not just say students did this activity, but to work out a system where you could say this activity belongs to this part of the continuum. And that's something that you really have to sort of sit down and think about together. It's not always obvious and the teachers may interpret it differently when they're entering data. So that was one thing to make sure was built in. And the other was that meant that then we worked with them to develop some reports that showed things like what percentage of your students had an experience in each of these 4 buckets, or, in just these 2 buckets or what have you. So that sort of gave them a feel across their different academies, what was going on. And so then it sort of pointed in a direction to like how which academies might want to build out more of their programming. And there were a couple of work-based learning coordinators who participated in the pilot and the development of the system who were really keen on kind of figuring that out within their school and kind of mapping that back to the program.
That's great to hear. Was it just kind of a useful exercise in getting everyone on the same playing field, speaking the same terminology, kind of pulling all in the same direction? Because I imagine if you haven't had too much experience with work-based learning before, like educators may not know exactly what the purpose is or where they're going with it, but was this kind of a useful way to get everyone on that same page?
Yeah, so we really kind of went through a process with folks. To start, we sort of had a small stakeholder group. So there's actually 4 high schools out of their 9 high schools in the district that were participating in the pilot. So we pulled together a group of folks who were interested in developing the system together. This included, a couple of teachers, a CTE or a Career Academy program director, a couple of work-based learning coordinators. We participated as research team members, and their district level work-based learning coordinator participated. So we did all kind of one of the first steps was to sit down together, and they had some, data they were already collecting about here's different kinds of activities, and kind of digging into that another layer to say, okay, well, what does it mean when you say community service versus this other thing? And kind of poking and finding the spots where people were actually coming with very different ideas from different programs, or, so it was a really good kind of level setting for that. And I think it also was sort of a good opportunity to kind of feedback to the principals and the leadership level, because I know the folks like the district work-based learning coordinator and the academy directors in the schools were really talking with their principals and their vice principals to kind of engage in a conversation about how important this was and the value of the work-based learning that was getting documented.
Sure, that's great to hear. That actually leads in really nicely to the second step of that toolkit that you and Claire have outlined, and that's really to establish that stakeholder group. You mentioned that this could include folks in the classroom, principals, folks at the district level. Can you tell us a little bit more about gathering that stakeholder group, and potentially what were some of those obstacles that did you encounter, and kind of how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so we pulled together, we have we're lucky to have a very close relationship with the district level folks, and they had some really they had great relationships with the work-based learning coordinators in each of the schools. But definitely one of the obstacles that we heard about from our primary partners in the district was that there's different levels of backing and understanding and support from the school level leadership. And so again, what Katherine was just speaking to is that, this process of kind of level setting and having folks who are in the schools who kind of were in charge of the work-based learning be part of the process of doing this really kind of was a nice way to get the leadership to kind of understand why this is important, because of course with any new data collection effort you need to have folks on board, because there's a lot of data collection in education, right? We're well aware of that, and so wanting to make sure that there's that folks are feeling like they're part of the process rather than having something done to them was really important. There was some staff turnover, but I don't think it affected our project too much and the development of this too much for us, but it's definitely one of those things that is just a reality, particularly in large urban districts. So if you had, especially if you had, say, one champion of this work-based learning data collection effort, and that champion leaves, that definitely leaves the door open for that to kind of fall apart a little bit. One of the things that even with the engagement of the stakeholders that was a little tricky is, of course, staff are really busy. So even before COVID, it was hard for folks to add in something extra into their day. So we had, a couple of the school level work-based learning coordinators who were a bit more engaged with the process and provided more feedback and did more of the kind of pilot, than a couple of the others. But that, again, is kind of to be expected because you're going to have more or less engagement. One of the nice things about that is I really think that the district level work-based learning coordinator was really able to kind of identify that the same process for training folks and supporting folks on the system for data collection was not possible across all of the schools or all of the educators within a school. So some educators need more one-on-one. Other educators might, be fine if you just kind of present some information to them. They created, the more, documentation and materials that could really help folks feel supported. So kind of going through some of those obstacles of thinking about, how do you implement, which I kind of shifted a little bit from the obstacles of just the stakeholder group, but these kind of are all, I think, interrelated in terms of thinking about how do you roll this out in a way that will be the most successful. I think.
No, that's very helpful. Yeah, that's really insightful. Katherine, anything you wanted to add to that, or any questions from the audience too? Feel free to drop those in. Otherwise, I'll just keep firing questions their way.
No, sounds good.
All right, sounds good. So one of the things you indicated in the toolkit is it's important to determine which aspects of work-based learning to actually measure. And this could include things, as you've already mentioned, like participation or just access to an opportunity or quality in some way, if you wanted to measure quality. There's a lot of various, outcomes there. Now that's really a lot to think about when you're trying to think about what exactly you want to measure with who. But can you give us kind of a breakdown on your process of thinking through with the district you worked with, or just any advice you would give to anyone kind of thinking about trying to measure work-based learning at the student level?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question because, I think we would all love to have really rich data on student outcomes and the quality of the programs, but those are really hard things, I think, for a lot of places to get with a lot of reliability. So, I mean, what happened in this case, we going back to those goals that we talked about previously, I think because a lot of the goals were around just getting the basics in place to be able to say who did what, and at the individual level, and then be able to use that to check on sort of tracking equity issues. With those being kind of big driving concerns, that's why we chose to focus on like participation as the major topic to cover. But there's definitely interest in sort of building out to add other components. And I would say, as a piece of advice, to kind of stage it probably makes sense. That for most schools or for most districts, like taking on all of those pieces at the same time may be a lot. And I know, even when we've worked with state agencies, we've talked about that, to try to sort of pick the low-hanging fruit to start with, and then try to build out those harder things over time. Just as one example, we've done some work with in Rhode Island with a state agency where they have a really nice rubric for understanding the quality of work-based learning experiences. So they've kind of gone through a process of figuring out, how do you define quality, and then what is a rubric for measuring that, and then making that rubric available. And then another stage would be trying to figure out how to collect on that on a regular basis. But it is a lot to do at once, and it's probably good to focus around what are your goals, and then what do you want to focus on to get to that.
I like that idea too, of kind of rolling it out in stages too. That way it's not overwhelming at first, and you're kind of working towards those goals incrementally. That's really useful advice, because it can definitely, especially with everything educators are already asked to do, it can feel like a lot, I'm sure, on their plate. But this, go ahead, Katherine.
I just did want to mention too, just to be clear, like the district does collect information about outcomes. For example, like they have employer ratings of students who participated in internships, and so there are ways that they're capturing that. So it's not that it doesn't exist. It's just that we didn't put the same sort of district-wide effort into building out systems for it.
Sure. That also fits nicely into another suggestion that you actually already mentioned, and that's kind of examining what is already being collected, right? So that you can potentially integrate together and provide a richer picture of just what's going on. How did that work with what was going on there with the district you were working with, and what might be useful, again, for folks to think about when they're kind of thinking about trying to implement a work-based learning tracking system?
Yeah, and this is actually something we do in a lot of the research I think we do with schools and districts and others, is really first understanding kind of what is available and what is there. So where is this data already being collected? Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of, and anyone on the call who is in a district or in a school knows that there's a lot of data collection that happens, oftentimes without a real connection to understanding what happens to that data once it's collected. And so really being able to maximize what's already happening and minimize new things is really, really important. Also understanding where there are gaps or where the data that's being collected that might seem like, oh, we already have information on work-based learning. We already know what types of work-based learning is happening, right? But is that the right kind of information? Is it collected in the right way? Is it coded the right way? So really kind of looking at the quality of the data, not necessarily the quality of the work-based learning opportunities. One of the things, for example, that you might be able to do is you might have a student information system that would allow teachers or educators to just enter, add another variable or two that would be something that they could enter for their students. That actually had been the original hope when we first started this, not the toolkit, but started the process of saying, okay, hey, this is really cool, but what you guys really need is student level data. The hope had been, oh, well, we could just add another module into the student information system. It'll be fine. And really came to realize that wasn't going to be possible. And so had to go through the process of kind of saying, okay, what's another data system or collection system that we could use, or that, and we really let them kind of guide themselves into kind of what would work for their district. And so that was a situation where kind of we initially started off thinking, oh, there's something that is already in place that everyone knows how to use. It hopefully would feel seamless, and it just didn't work out that way. Though I think the district is still hopeful that perhaps down the road that's something that can happen. Yeah, I think, again, one of the things that we mentioned, and you may have another question later, I apologize around this, but one of the things that we mentioned in the toolkit is kind of this takes not just there's a few different culture shifts potentially that are happening here, right? One is this idea that it's important to collect student level work-based learning data, right? So that's a shift in and of itself. And then the other shift is potentially kind of this technology shift where if you have to have another way, which ended up having to happen in Elk Grove, another way that's a new technology system for educators to use, now all of a sudden we're talking about another shift, right? And so the degree to which you can reduce the amount of shifts that need to happen in terms of the daily life of an educator, the better. So I think that's why this step is so super important.
Makes total sense. Yeah, you would want the lift to be as seamless or yeah, as integrated as possible. So how did you get educators excited about that? You know, kind of adding some new things to their plate, new technologies, new ways of thinking about work-based learning and tracking. What advice can you give to people who may be struggling to get buy-in on that topic from either a principal or a district level person? You know, what was your process around that?
Yeah, well, we really found that, educators are going to get excited if they can see directly what is the benefit of these data for my life, and for the decisions I need to make and the things I need to do. So that really drove where we saw the progress. So, for example, when there was a work-based learning coordinator who was able to kind of add on to understanding that like mapping of like, well, who's doing which types of activities on the continuum, be able to get that and see it was really powerful. Working out, making sure that the reporting really showed what was useful for somebody sitting in the academy for their day-to-day programming. So, for example, be able to show some of that equity data and be able to say, oh, okay, well, here's how many events on average folks are actually attending, and how does that break out for multilingual learner students compared to other students? How does that break out for a student who's in different grade levels and different kinds of things like that? I think also, we found that if you can promote a little bit of healthy competition, that's something that our district partners always said is useful. So, for example, it's always, I think Claire mentioned this, you don't want to collect data and have it sit somewhere and you have no idea what the school or the district did with your data. It's very demotivating. But reporting back to the career academies, here's what we saw in your data. This will look right, and this is how you compare to the other programs in the district. That can really kind of promote a sense of ownership, and an academy director or a principal is more likely to say, oh, well, I think we actually did a lot more stuff and I don't see it in my data. Let's make sure we get that in there next year, because they really want to be able to get credit for what they've done and be able to like build on it. And it kind of can be a motivating factor, or it could be a factor to say, oh, okay, I see that actually the academy next door was doing a lot around, these sort of like, kind of middle of the continuum activities, and we don't seem like we're doing that. Let's go talk to them about what we can learn about that. So I think that kind of usage, it's feeding the data back as easily as possible and making sure there are reports that a teacher or a program director could use was really important.
Excellent. I've seen some of that aspect of healthy competition in other things, like NAF has an annual student survey, and I know definitely there's competition there sometimes between academies. So that was kind of interesting to hear. I got a question kind of through the chat, through the back channel, so it's not actually on the group chat, but kind of hitting on that reporting data. How did you all share the data back with the educators? Did they review like a dashboard or a report, or was it just the educators that saw this stuff, or did students potentially have access to anything? What was your process like for that?
Yeah, so I think a dashboard would be fabulous. And so I think that's a down the road, again, getting at the kind of stages of things. So I definitely think that would be great. So to date, we ourselves have actually shared, so we've created reports and shared them with our district partners, who have then shared out with the educators. But Katherine, correct me if I'm forgetting something, because that's not entirely impossible. I forget lots of things. But again, I think some of, at least in the last couple of years, some of our not sharing too much with the district or with the school level educators partly comes from the fact that COVID has been happening. And so besides the fact that it's been hard for them to engage in work-based learning, above, like last year, I think it was mostly lectures, which actually some of the virtual stuff actually we heard increased, right? Some of the ability to get folks to come in who otherwise may not have been able to attend. So that was kind of an interesting positive aspect of it. So we haven't had super complete data over the last couple of years. And so we've been hesitant to make too much generalization, but we've presented, I think, to the folks who helped us with the pilot piece of things, and then also with our district level folks, like I said. But Katherine, do you want to jump in? I'm not sure if I'm forgetting a piece of things that we did.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that they've been doing in the district that are helping kind of push reports out to end users. So as Claire alluded to, what they've ended up deciding worked for their district was to use a system. It's actually called 5-Star Student, and it's like an online database platform. So you can enter, all this data ends up in there, and then it can be like merged with their regular system. So what that system allows is for an educator who's entering data to pull down a lot of reporting that shows all kinds of things broken out different ways about who is doing what in their program or in other programs. My understanding is that they've also been able to do some student-facing reporting. So there's like a student mobile app that students can download on their phone. And I know that there were students who wanted to track their sort of hours of work-based learning for different purposes. And so they have a way of sharing that back to students. And I can get this information back for you. I'm not sure if it's through the mobile app or if the teacher has to pull it down from 5-Star, but it is available to students. And then last, actually, one thing about the dashboards, I know they are in development. They're for internships. They're developing using Tableau visualization software. They're working on a dashboard that's available pretty much to all the staff in the district to be able to see a lot of different things, like by industry sector and different things about participation in internships particularly. So I think that's something they're looking at doing for other parts of their work-based learning.
See, I knew I forgot something.
No worries. That's wonderful to hear, because I tell you, that's something we're constantly thinking about at NAF. Like, not only how can we help educators collect good quality data, but then also turn it around for them so that they could use it for a process like that. Can I, well, actually, we're reaching the part where I'm going to open it up for questions if folks want to come off mute or share their video camera. So let me allow that really quick. I just allowed mics. Let me allow video. So please do feel free to come off mute if you would like to. Where is the video? Allow cameras. Okay. If not, I have kind of an in the weeds question for Katherine and Claire that I'm curious about, but maybe I can start off with the in the weeds question. So in terms of actually tracking that work-based learning experience, what was the method? Katherine, you mentioned the system. I forget what you called it, that integrated with some of their other stuff, but were teachers actually, was it the teacher recording the work-based learning experience, or was it a student? Kind of walk us through the nuts and bolts like that if people are thinking of their questions, if they want to come off mute.
Yeah, I guess I'll start at Claire. Maybe you'll probably remember more of the details on it. So one of the reasons that the school selected this 5-Star student system was because they want, and we're not sort of advocating for any particular platform. This just happens to be what was available and made sense in this district, but they have had a good experience with it. So it, because like we said at the beginning, work-based learning happens all over the place, lots of different people touching it, so to have a system that allows different modes of data collection by different people was really helpful. So there was a range of things that were possible. One is like they got barcode scanners and scanned student IDs when they walked into like a bigger event. That really streamlined things, that it just like shoots back into the database. Students could enter for themselves in a mobile app. So like a student doing something like their work, and they have agriculture programs, and it's very sort of student self-supervised some of the work. So the student could put that in their mobile app. They did a little experimenting with something called a beacon, which is like this object you can place in a location. And then if the student is there at the location, like let's say an employer work site or a place on campus where they're doing, the culinary area where they're doing learning in the kitchen or something, the student can check in, and so there's just like some different modalities that were possible for both teachers, students, and work-based learning coordinators to have the ability to be data collectors. So that might, I think having said that, the trick with that is you want to have some conversations around trying to have a reliable process and not just have it willy-nilly and people doing things different ways. So we work together on some kind of documenting about ways to do that. And I know, Claire, I may be forgetting some other ways that they did this.
No, I think I think this brings up some of the potential challenges though. So for example, this idea of having a student app is really wonderful, but of course you can't require students to download an app. And that actually there was a similar concern with teachers, right? So teachers can also download a mobile app, but most teachers are not given school cell phones, right? So there's no way to, you can't ever force a teacher to download that. So it definitely I think took some figuring out. Like Katherine said, I think they figured out the beacon. So that, like she said, the beacon, you put it somewhere, and if they're within a radius of that, then they can check in. Otherwise they can't check in. Or you can give a check-in time or a code. So that's kind of that gives some of the data quality piece around it, which is really valuable. But again, there's still that needing them to understand the importance of one of the things that this system allowed for. So a lot of the schools in the district actually already use this system. So this gets at kind of they already use this system for their PBIS tracking. And this system also is used sometimes for tickets for sporting events and checking students into sporting events. So that barcode scanner thing. One of the things that it allowed folks to do or allowed them to do would be you can either have students check in or check students in and out of something, and it gives them a certain number of hours, or you can give them a certain number. What we did was like gray points or whatever. So you give them a certain number of points, which basically would be equivalent to a certain number of hours. So if you knew that you didn't want to check students in and out of an event, but you wanted to just say, okay, if you come to this event, that's on average going to be an hour of work-based learning or 2 hours. You could say, okay, 1 point for the 1 hour, 2 points. So one of the things you have to think about that that's one of the challenges I think we're at right now tackling is kind of what does that data look like on the back end, and how do you make sure that if some of those opportunities are coded with hours and others are coded with points, and so those are some of the things that with the different methods of data collection and also the different ways that educators enter a work-based learning opportunity into the system to begin with, that kind of dictates what that data is going to look like. So again, that gets at that the systematizing of it as well.
Yeah, I could see how that could be really useful just from a research perspective, right? Because there's always this question of dosage, like how much work-based learning or what types of work-based learning are most valuable. Because there's good research out there that some form of work-based learning, some types of work-based learning relate to educational and kind of career outcomes, but it's not really sure what that sweet spot is. So are you thinking, as advances in this area kind of get better at cataloging and recording that, this could be very useful for the research community as well as the educators themselves?
Absolutely. And that's, well, both researchers and educators, I think, share an interest in some of those questions because, a school or a district is thinking about what do I want to invest in? Like, where am I really going to get gains in student skills, gains in student career readiness? Where am I going to see that? So being able to see something about how many hours students actually participated and in what is just incredibly valuable for that learning. And I think that's something you can do, within one's own school district. It's also something, you can invite an evaluator to come in or a researcher to come in and do like maybe with a sample and go really deep, and get a lot of data from a smaller group just because that can be easier sometimes. But yeah, I think that those are shared questions that are important for the field.
Sure. Does anyone in the audience, I want to make sure I do give the audience a chance as well. Does anyone in the audience have any questions they'd like to ask Katherine or Claire directly? Folks, a second. Maybe they're just soaking it all in. Oh, I see someone chat or typing in the chat. Yep, soaking it all in. All right, thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, I knew that could be the case because it's a lot of good information being shared here. I'm kind of curious because as I mentioned, NAF is currently experimenting with a work-based learning tracker as well, and we're kind of grappling with a lot of the same things. One of the things we are thinking about or considering is, if I'm a student and I'm uploading, a number of work-based learning activities across a school year, was there any thought or at least any discussion or, any any potential buy-in from the school district on, like, if I uploaded, say, 10 work-based learning activities, what might I be able to do, or is there a tool in place that could then turn that around for something like a resume, or, you know, make it easily accessible to me as a student to get that information back in any way? Did conversations like that ever come up, or any consideration there?
I think Katherine kind of already mentioned this a little bit. So I do think that the 5-star does allow the students to get student reports, although that is a piece of the things that a piece of the process that I know I'm not as well versed in, but I know we've had multiple conversations with the district level person overseeing all of this, and she has a very big interest in making sure that students are getting something out of it and really understanding kind of for their purposes, what have their experiences been for the CV, for the, like I said, I think and I apologize for those of you from California that are probably like, you're butchering the description, but to apply to the California schools, they are asking for things like, what are the number of internship hours you have? And so I know that's an interest. Katherine, you might know more. I don't know on how they're potentially going to roll that out. I would see that as a definite benefit, but I'm not 100% sure how they're thinking of doing that at this point.
Yeah, I would just echo that really there was a lot of interest in the value of that, and I know that at least within this online platform, there's a possibility of printing out a report that's like a student level report of summarizing what they've done. So I think that to my knowledge, that may be the level at which it's happening now, but that they were interested in looking at other ways, and I would encourage NAF to do that, because when we talk about sort of getting buy-in, I mean, students are definitely a group that you want buy-in so that they'll enter their own hours, but also like these things can be tied into, I know folks have NAF academies at many different places, but if there's a portrait of a graduate or a senior capstone requirement or just different individualized student learning plans, these are pieces that could feed into those. That, like, information about your work-based learning accomplishment could feed into all of those types of requirements and be really valuable for, various people in the school. So I would definitely consider that.
Hang on, I'm getting a question in the back channels here. Yep, Alyssa, thanks very much. Yep, she's saying a lot of great information. Appreciate you sharing, just soaking it up. A question coming in on my end here. Do you feel the district is vested in measuring work-based learning for the long term, or is it more of just a short-term kind of measurement thing?
Yeah,
Claire, you want to start? Yeah.
I was giving you a second, but yeah, no, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most exciting things about working with this district is how invested they are in this. Even through, so our primary partner, she has had a couple of different roles, and all throughout she has remained steadfast in terms of this is a priority of the district and we're rolling this out. Even through COVID and the difficulties there, they've remained dedicated to this. They're looking forward to rolling out new training again on the system at the start of the upcoming school year, and really getting people to be, doing as much data collection as possible. So I'd say all signs point to yes, they're kind of in this for the long haul. Katherine, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, definitely. And that was kind of like the good kind of synergy of this. The research study had particular questions, but this was never like data collection that was just for the purpose of a research study. It very much was like in support of longer term efforts in the district, because it really is around like being able to improve programs. I mean, even being able to kind of, share back with their industry partners to be able to say, this is kind of what the shape of these experiences look like, and encouraging, more industry participation. So they see a lot of value in it.
Great. I know one thing that before I go on, any other questions from the audience we can have the experts answer? This has been a lot of great just insight and suggestions on some of the issues you all had to face, some of the lessons you all learned. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and coming on and just telling us about it. Is there anything else kind of as parting words you would like our audience to know, that if they're thinking about tracking work-based learning, or anything else you would like to impart for educators, for district folks, anyone in particular?
I would just say it's definitely worth the time to kind of think about some advanced planning that'll help you get what you really want out of your data system, and that it's worth the time to put a system in place, because the kind of sort of driving your program improvements and student outcomes is really critical. And I think it's a useful step in that.
Yeah, nothing else for me. I think Katherine really covered it.
Righty. I wanted to make the audience aware that at the end of that toolkit, Katherine and Claire have included things like sample reports, tips for evaluators when it comes to increasing the reliability of the data, analyzing the data. Anything else you'd like to mention around any of that supplemental information that the audience might want to know about?
I don't think so. Just, that of course it's just examples. And so, what works for you and your partners and colleagues might not look exactly the same as what worked for us and the district, but we definitely wanted to make sure that, the tools that we had created in collaboration with our partners in the district we thought they were valuable. They seemed to be really useful for our partners. And so we thought there was value in sharing them. But of course, we're not saying that that's necessarily, in terms of the tools themselves, the right way. It really, part of it depends on kind of what your context is. But I don't think anything else.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much for being generous with your time. I'm gonna stick to our 1 hour here, so in case people have other obligations afterwards. But something I always ask, in kind of the closing moments, is how can our audience or anyone watching this talk after the fact kind of keep up to date on what you all are doing? Are you both on Twitter? Are you on social media? Like, where can our audience follow the work you're doing? Katherine, you gave me some links. I'm going to enter them in the chat. But Claire, if you would like to drop your email address or your Twitter handle or anything like that in the chat, I will be sure to post it along with the video when I upload it later as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely follow EDC on Twitter. And also, I'm happy to get a direct email to me personally. Always happy to engage with anybody about that. I also post my research on LinkedIn on my profile there, so that's a good place to catch it. And I do want to put in a plug for the Cte Research Network, which is a U.S. Department of Ed funded group that you can sign up for their newsletter. They don't spam you. They're useful information every once in a while about the latest and greatest research coming out on kind of like what's working in CTE. So that's another place that various folks' research is available.
And I think LinkedIn is probably the best. I don't have it up, but it would just be Claire Waterman on LinkedIn is a good way to keep up with my work as well.
All right, wonderful. Katherine and Claire, thanks so much for joining us today. As always, feel free that this is always a platform for you. If you have any other things you'd like to come on and talk about, any other research you'd like to come on and talk about, or anything else, just trying to get that free pizza if you're a repeat guest. But thanks again so much for your time. And to our audience, we don't yet have our next Research and Tech Talk scheduled, but if you are on our email list, keep an eye out for that, because we are in the process of trying to arrange 2 or 3 in the near future. So thanks everyone, and be sure to have a good day.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks again, Katherine. Thanks, Claire.